I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, home to the one and only story cycle system. Do you want people to actually give a crap about you and your purpose-driven company? Then our proven system will help you tell them a better friggin' story. And that's the secret sauce, folks. You gotta have a better, clear story. You can get started right now by downloading your 64-page DIY brand story strategy workbook at businessofstory.com. It's filled with examples, links to tutorial videos, and will help you clarify your story to grow your revenue and amplify your impact. And if you're really proud of how your brand story comes together, let me know. We might put you on our show to share your new narrative with the world. So download your story cycle guide right now as you listen to today's show.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Like today's guest, I learned at an early age the power of storytelling for survival. I was one of 7 kids, all born within 9 years of each other. Yep, that's right, Catholic. And our parents had one rule at the dinner table. You had to keep one foot on the floor. Everything else was fair game. But if you were going to stand out and survive in the Howell clan, you had better be pretty quick on your feet, or foot, as it were, and be able to tell a better story than your siblings. That was the secret sauce. I was reminded of stories in my youth this week when I interviewed Gideon For-mukwai for Business of Story. Gideon is the founder of Story Warrior Associates. He helps professionals and entrepreneurs leverage the power of storytelling to win hearts and minds for profit. Gideon was exposed to the power of stories growing up in a small village outside of Cameroon on the west coast of Central Africa. On today's show, he shares how the stories he learned from his elders have inspired how he works with business storytelling today. As a battle-tested storyteller who has used the craft to build his own business in Singapore and the U.S., Gideon believes stories are a unique and untapped strategic asset in all organizations that must be used strategically to engage, encourage, and persuade. You'll learn about Gideon's interesting story DNA method. What do you think DNA stands for? Well, he's going to let you know in today's show. He'll recall his greatest storytelling flop and how it propelled him into his career as a story coach. Gideon reveals the story mistakes most leaders make, and he shares the 4 elements he has found to make every single story work. Gideon has a dream that one day every business presenter will dispense of PowerPoint and embrace StoryPoint. When that day comes, he says people will stop fiddling with their iPads and iPods or fall asleep during your presentations. So let's help him start realizing his dream by teaching you the Story Warrior Way with Gideon For-mukwai. Hey, Gideon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Park. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's great to have you here. You were so kind. I think it was about a year ago. You sent me your new book, The Science of Storytelling, How to Win the Hearts and Minds of Your Prospects for Profit and Purpose. And I love it because it's a nice little user's manual almost that you can have at the ready anytime to go in and get insights into storytelling for brands, for businesses, for leaders. How did you get in the business storytelling world?
Thank you for the question. I got into this business by sheer luck, or should I say by accident, because I never thought I would be in this field. I was living and working in Southeast Asia, precisely in Singapore, and I joined an organization known as Toastmasters. and I was very interested in public speaking competitions. In one of the events, I think I'd done fairly well. A lady who had been organizing international competitions pulled me to the side and said, "Young man, I think you're quite good at this, but if you want to do this for a living or you ever want to excel at this, I want you to study the art of storytelling because it's going to set you ahead of everyone else." And that was way back in 2003. And I started to study and obsessively learn about storytelling, but not knowing that I would ever one day use it as a source of income. So that's a long answer to a short question.
No, great. Where were you born? Give us your backstory to how you found yourself in Singapore and what were you doing there?
Oh, interesting. I was born and raised in a very small French-speaking country in Central Africa. It's known as Cameroon. I had most of my education, my formal education there. And although I grew up in a very small village in the countryside, which is, I would say, materially very poor, but narratively very rich. And it's bursting at the seams with the power of narrative. People use narratives in communicating, in persuading, in doing almost anything. They will use the power of narratives to transform the village from one that could not care anything much about electricity, about power, or about public water systems into getting everyone to buy in. And what they did was they would use the power of storytelling to say, "Hey, look at us. We are losing. Other villages are advancing. We need to make some progress." So I grew up in that setting, seeing the power of storytelling come to life several times. And when I left from Africa and went to Asia, I was more of an economist. And I never thought that I would use storytelling to make a living someday. But as things turned out, later on, I discovered that, wow, some of that narrative culture was deep in me, and I was capable of using it to make a living.
So you went from this small village outside of Cameroon in Central Africa. Where did you go to school to become an economist?
I studied in Cameroon, both in the English-speaking side and the French-speaking side. After college, I went to work in South Africa for a Boston-based newswire. And when I worked in South Africa for the Boston-based newswire, that was in the late 90s when IT was a big thing. So I decided that I wanted to study IT. From having majored in economics at undergraduate, I thought I should move into IT world. And the best place to go for that, where I could afford it, was Singapore. So I ended up in Singapore. However, when I got there, the trajectory of my my interest in IT totally changed, and I moved in a different direction. But I would say the initial interest in storytelling was born in Singapore, although the kernel of it, the gem of it, was already lying in me from way back growing up in Cameroon in Central Africa.
Let's explore that just briefly. Do you remember a time when you were a child or a small boy, maybe even in your teens, where you heard an elder, a leader, whomever around you tell a story that really ignited this interest in you?
Oh, yes. Many, many times, almost to the point whereby it would be impossible to choose because I have so many competing examples. I know one thing for sure, that in our village setting, there would be occasions when the elders would sit on one side, the women would sit on one side, the young kids would sit on one side, and there would be an occasion for one of the elderly men to tell a story about how our village got to be where it was. Who were the enemies that they had to fight to be able to survive, and why it was important that everyone should always work together so that if the enemy ever comes again, they would know what to do. And so that was very much in the fabric of almost everything that they taught us in the village setting. And there were several occasions on which, when they tell a very frightening story, let's say it's late in the night, say 9 p.m., we would get to immerse ourselves so much in that fearful or scary situation, so much so that walking back to our home would almost be a challenge without any assistance from an adult. And this would be because of the fact that they use imagery, they use powerful metaphors that made us feel scared, even though there was nothing very imminent. And then another occasion in which I saw them use the power of story was when there was a storm, and the storm was so strong, so much so that it blew off the roof of our primary school, and it's the only school that we had in our village. And in order to rally people around, both in that village and the villages around or even beyond, to contribute money for the school to be rebuilt, I saw how the elders used the power of story in igniting a sense of belonging, in igniting a sense of purpose. And everybody rallied around, even though they were not wealthy people. But within a matter of 2 months, they had raised an incredible sum of money for the school to be rebuilt. And although this happened several times, each time there was always a new narrative that they used to get everyone together and got people working for free just so that the school can be rebuilt. So I would say there are quite a number of examples that I would even want to explore, but maybe those two would be sufficient for now. Yeah.
No, those are great. So Gideon, when you were raised in this and absolutely bathed in narrative culture through your village there, and then you went to school, you studied, you went into technology through IT, ended up in Singapore. Did you find that there was a dearth or extraordinarily lack of storytelling in the corporate world? And what was that like, going from being so immersed in narrative to now being in a world that almost doesn't use it? It's almost completely void of it.
Very true. I can't even explain it because there were so many occasions in which my seniors would tell me, no story, just get straight to the facts, get to the facts. And that was painful, very painful, because when I ended up, got settled in Singapore, was working for the government at the time, and it was a uniform organization. I don't think I want to call the name here, even though I have utmost respect for them. They would say, we want you to get straight to the facts. And it was a technical area. Now, and I noticed that whenever I was able to sneak in a little story, the students would sit up and they would listen very attentively. But no other instructor, no other younger or senior instructor like myself was using story. But I noticed that even though they would say, get straight to the facts and nothing but the facts, whenever I was able to sneak in a story, I could see that my students were consuming it like it was something so beautiful, something so special. And so I never failed to always find that opportunity to sneak it in either during class or after class. And then it began to manifest itself to me over and over that there was something special about it. And the only place where I was able to manifest that very much was when I got into public speaking. And even though I was training on topics like crisis management, emergency management, I noticed that the best part of my evaluation papers when they came back from my participants were always based on, oh, we love that story you told very much. We really find that was interesting. So the interesting elements were not often the technical material that I delivered. Very often it was the stories that I used or infused into my conversation to make the technical areas to become clear. But I totally agree with you. There was a significant depth of storytelling or narratives in the corporate world, which I believe it's not only in Asia, but I think I've seen a bit of that also here in America.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see it everywhere. You and I are making a living off of helping people sneak those little stories in because it's kind of your secret weapon, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't you agree or not that, to me anyways, storytelling is our one true superpower, because when you use it, you can connect with people and move them to action like never before.
Absolutely true. I would very much agree with you that it's a hidden superpower. And I would tell some of my audiences, I spoke with an audience last week, and I told them that storytelling is an invisible asset. It is an invisible asset that you can use, you can deploy it in ways that nobody would even know that you're deploying it, but it would win over friends. And just about 2 hours ago, I was speaking to an HR group, a human resource group here in Astoria, Oregon. And I was talking or sharing with them about the power of sharing unsung hero stories. And I also highlighted to them that even though they may find it a little bit uncomfortable, if they were to sneak in tiny bits of stories into their presentations, into their memos, into newsletters, they would notice that they can humanize every technical topic, no matter how difficult it may be. They can humanize that topic with stories, and that will allow their audiences to their employees, fellow employees, or people outside the organization to better relate to what they are trying to communicate. And I could see all of them were nodding, and they were nodding in agreement, not in disagreement.
Well, yeah, I mean, storytelling, it doesn't matter if you come from a tiny village outside of Cameroon or grew up in Manhattan. It's what unites us. It's what connects all of our tribes and makes us the social beings we are today. And yet, even though you and I know that, and so many, many people know it, for some reason, we don't include it in our business worlds and in our presentations. And it just is mind-boggling to me. I'm just thinking, at least from America's standpoint, we were all at the tops of our storytelling games in kindergarten, and we were shushed after that. And yet, it is the one thing that you can absolutely own a room using. For example, Russell Goldstein is a student of mine at ASU in the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership program. He's in the financial services world, and he's getting his master's in sustainability leadership, and I teach the communication storytelling course there. He sent me a note the other day. He's like, boy, when I first started, I didn't think this storytelling thing had anything to it. And now all I do is tell stories in my presentations. And he sent me one of his speaker evaluations. And real quick, Gideon, let me read you a couple of the things here's what his audience had to say. Engaging, motivating, energetic was one. Number 2, I wish there had been more time spent with the panel and Russ. Number 3, great, very, very relevant. Number 4, Russ is a great storyteller. 5, really engaging, great story. 6, enjoyed the fact that there were personal stories interspersed with the relevant topic. I can go on and on and on down here. Here's a guy, financial services world, like your IT world, or the financial services, that you were dealing with, there's just completely unversed in the power of story. And yet when they use it, even little bits of it, like you did when you snuck it in there, you will bewitch your audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You wouldn't believe this. I know you live in Phoenix. Is that true?
That is true. Yep.
Yes. Phoenix has once saved my life. And if you permit me, I'll share with you one quick experience that turns my world upside down and eventually.
Are you going to start in Toronto? Because I read a little bit about this in your book. So give us the whole story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think by 2005, I was already doing fairly well in the training and workshop management industry in Asia. And I felt very comfortable that I was onto something really good. And when I went to Toronto, I was invited to do a free talk in Toronto. And they flew me. No, they didn't fly me. I flew myself there, but they gave me a free hotel. And but the mistake I made when I went to Toronto was that it was my first time speaking in the Western world. I'd done enough in Africa, in Asia, and parts of Middle East, but I'd never spoken in Western world. So I thought maybe this Western audience, they're native English speakers, they would be judging me, and maybe they would not be interested in story. So I made a huge mistake of taking out all the narratives that I had in my presentation. And I went upstage, did my thing, but I noticed after 5 minutes that I was basically on stage alone. I wasn't having the audience with me as I would say I'm usually with them or they're with me. So it was a terrible nightmare. I was pacing around like a chimp in a cage. It was so bad. I didn't know what to do with myself. It got really so bad that even after the event, even the coffee lady did not want to share with me coffee. That was bad.
Now, wait a minute. So here you are. You've learned, the power of story. You've been using it in Asia. You go to Toronto, fly yourself out there. So obviously you're investing in your career to be able to make these kinds of presentations. And you make the fatal mistake of removing all the stories from your presentation, so much so that now the coffee lady won't even give you coffee?
Absolutely. It was so humbling, and the reason I did not include any story was I thought Western audiences, they must be very serious people, they must be very technically minded, and nobody would care about my stories. And that was a fatal mistake because I did not connect and I went back home literally feeling like I have to abandon this thing and go find another job. And so, in the course of thinking about that, I'm doing my own postmortem and asking, where did I go wrong? What didn't work? I stumbled on a professional speakers magazine, and I have to give credit here to somebody in Louisiana whom I've never met but was an incredible mentor, a lady by name Jean Gatz. So I called up Jean Gatz once I saw her name in the professional speakers magazine. I said, Jean, I just got back from Toronto. It was a terrible presentation. I don't know. Can you help me in some way? She agreed to help me out. And she coached me over the phone. I've never met her to this day. And I would send my stories to her. She would look through. And then she asked me, how many stories did you share in Toronto? I said, no story at all. She asked me why. I said, because it was a technical presentation. There was a long pause. After that long pause, Jean said to me, no, Gideon, remember, stories are the lifeblood of a presentation, however technical. And from then, we worked for about a month and a half. She looked through my presentation, helped me in tightening my stories. And I was lucky that the same presentation I gave in Toronto, I was asked to give that presentation in Phoenix. So November 2005, I flew into Phoenix and gave the same presentation to a similar audience. And this time, nobody staged a walkout, nobody was angry. And I would bet that if there was a coffee lady there, she would have served me a lot of coffee. And I had a great time. I had many friends from that presentation to this day. When I look back, I just tell myself that I'm the one who shot myself in the foot because I didn't serve the audience what they're already expecting. Even though it was a technical presentation, I needed to include the lifeblood of a presentation, which is a story. And that is a very humbling lesson from Toronto, but I'm glad that Phoenix came in to save my life in 2005. And since then, the rest has been as I say, the rest is history.
You know, Gideon, all I can see is those elders sitting back in your village shaking their head in dismay that their young protege was not out there sharing stories with the crazy North Americans.
That is interesting. And the tag on to that would be that 4 years after Phoenix, I was living in Nevada and doing a master's program in journalism. And guess what happened? I ran into somebody who was in the room not in Toronto, but in Phoenix. And this gentleman was able to remember me after 4 years. He did not only remember me, but he remembered a significant part of the story that I shared in Phoenix. And that told me this is something different. And as a result of that, he gave me a really good package for my summer job in 2009, which was a very bad year. So one story told can be remembered 4 years later. And not only that, it could change the course of your career if that's anything to go by.
Well, isn't that the truth? I mean, stories, that's one of the most potent things about them is they are incredibly memorable. I've had the same thing happen where I've had people come up to me 6 years after the fact and say, oh, I see you're presenting today. Are you going to tell that one story about such and such? And I am so amazed when they can have that kind of recall and it doesn't even have to be some big, long, epic journey story. It can be just a short little moment, something that really resonates with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with you, Park.
So you were studying journalism. Where did you think about going in to be a journalist, or where did you move on after your journalism studies?
After journalism studies, I was very aware that I didn't want to be a regular journalist, but I wanted to use the ability to write well, to listen well, to be able to draw information from someone and turn it into something significant. So I wanted to take my journalism and my ability to communicate and go into running public workshops, training, and public speaking. And so after that program in Nevada, I worked for 1 year and I returned to Singapore. So from 2012 to 2015, I was back in Singapore and I hit the ground running, conducting workshops. And at that time, I think I had pretty much decided that storytelling was a big piece of my business, but I didn't want to go full time. I still hesitated. I did not want to be identified as a storyteller. I said, I spent all my life learning technical subjects. I did not want to be considered a storyteller. But a number of friends who had seen me do work professionally, a Canadian friend of mine by name Tom Abbott is the one that sat me down and said, Gideon, you have to take this thing seriously. You can see that people are really paying attention to what you're saying, what you're doing. Maybe you should do it full time. I resisted it from 2012 till 2013 before I went full time, earning, say, 80% of my income now comes from teaching executives how to write or how to craft and tell their own stories.
So Gideon, why did you resist it? Did you feel like there just wasn't enough substance to it, or that you had studied, technology and it wasn't technical enough? And the reason why I ask this is so often I hear leaders say, oh, communications, storytelling, that's the soft skill in business. Technology is the hard skill, basically saying my technology can beat up your soft skill of communications. Was that your concern, or why were you reluctant?
Yes, you are very right. To me, it was like I have spent time studying economics. I spent time studying other technical areas like crisis management, and I had a fairly recognizable name in that area. Why would I go into storytelling? But I didn't know that story could be used in almost every area. So I struggled with that decision and whether I could make a full-time income from it. So when it took me that 1 year, I started pitching more workshops in that area. And as things turned out, I was getting calls from places like Brunei, Darussalam. I was getting calls from Hong Kong to go conduct programs in that area. So I felt like, okay, maybe I'm hesitant, but this story thing is much stronger. It's not just a soft skill, but it's much stronger than anything that I had anticipated. And so that's when I finally made a call in 2013 to change the name of my business from Extra Mile Solutions. I went to Business Training Academy, and then later on, I went on to choose Story Warrior, because everywhere I went, one or two people will be saying, Gideon is a story guy, Gideon is a story warrior. And when I tested that name, I realized that most people looked up to see who is a guy called Story Warrior. So that's how my reluctance evolved to acceptance over time, thanks to my customers and thanks to some of my associates.
Story Warrior. Now, do you think that plays off those stories you heard as a young boy around your elders when they were talking about the origin stories of your village and all of the people, the other tribesmen that they had to fight off to remain successful and sustainable?
In some ways, I would say yes. It would be because, sometimes we have these hidden gems in us. We don't even know that we have them. And over time, when it gets to a moment when you awaken those, awaken those giants within you, awaken those gems within you, polish them up, then you realize that it amounts to something. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that some of those basic elements were lying dormant in me until the right time, because I would admit that I have met some of very, very talented storytellers out here and in Asia. But when I think about some of those guys back in Africa who were not, they didn't have any formal education, but the ability that they were able to piece together a story with so many facts, and they would be able to move you to the point whereby you're afraid to walk out at night. I think that they definitely had some special ability. And as a result of that, I would say yes, that might have rubbed off on me in a positive way, and this could potentially be manifesting itself today.
And do you think they had a special ability, or do you think they just simply were intentional about telling stories and they honed their craft by doing it over and over and over again? Because if evolution has taught us anything, or biology for that matter, I guess, is that stories are uniquely human.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I think part of it would be training. Part of it would be the cultural immersion. The training in the sense that if in a village setting, if you had to get the attention of, they say, the significant elders, you wanted to get attention of the people that would make decisions, you better have to have the ability to weave in a narrative that is coherent. And or if you had to gain favors from people, you had to part of your ability or part of your social currency had to be story. And I know that there were many guys that would get a free meal here and there because of their ability to weave together a story that everybody will be nodding and everybody want them to come around. So maybe the cultural immersion is a big part. And the other part is that if people identified its importance, they would potentially work or learn more about that and communicated more with that. And here's another fact that I think is important. Given the fact that formal education wasn't a big part of life in the villages way back before the 1940s, I think that narrative, which, like you mentioned, was a single source of, it was a single means of transmission of values, transmission of risk and threats that the village faces. It was a single currency that everybody traded on. Like, I think you know Robert McKee. He says that stories are the currency of human contact. So I think maybe that's the reason why villagers tended to depend very much on that.
And Robert McKee, for those of you who don't know that are listening in, is one of literally the world's foremost screenwriting coach and teacher. And Gideon and I had the chance to sit in his story workshop in LA, in the Sheraton at LAX for 4 days, and then had a chance to interview him in his home in Connecticut for my very first attempt at podcasting that only, ended up in 10 episodes. And then finally, Robert McKee joined me here at Business of Story on 2 separate occasions. So I know him and his work very well. And you're right. I mean, story is social currency. And you demonstrated it right there. The man that needed to get a meal was the one that could tell the best story and was invited into the home to share at the hearth. I mean, and yet we see that today in the tribes, in the social customs of corporations, and how people work together in groups and individually. But if you're going to have social currency within those organizations and in the boardrooms and break rooms that you are trying to communicate with and connect with the people in, story is the only way to do it. I honestly don't know any other way but story to do that.
You are absolutely right. And there's Uri Hassan, I think he's a researcher at Princeton. He says that stories are the best way to put new ideas into the world. I'm not quoting it verbatim, but I know for sure I followed his work for quite some time. And he says it's one of the best ways to put new ideas into the world. And I think I can't dispute that. I would say, yes, if you want to put ideas in the world in a way that is subtle and not cohesive, in a way that is persuasive and not cohesive, story is the best way to put ideas out there without getting into a fight, without arm twisting, without sounding like though you are better than anyone else. Let the characters do the talking. Let the characters provide the lesson. Let the characters frame the issue. And you could just sit back and watch everybody else either agree with you or take the time to think over those ideas and subsequently agree with you, because you have framed the issue in a way that they cannot resist it at all.
And you're right. You, as the presenter, are simply the vehicle that is presenting those stories that then helps them arrive at their own conclusions or make up their own minds, and it keeps them out of arguing with you.
That's right. Absolutely true.
Well, let's talk about your book, The Science of Storytelling, How to Win the Hearts and Minds of Your Prospects for Profit and Purpose. Now, the first question I have before we get into why you wrote your book, I'm looking at your cover, and you've got a hand coming up, and you have 3 thought bubbles. And in one thought bubble on the left, there's a red heart. And then on the thought bubble on the right is a brain, and you have C8, H11, and O2 connected to those. What does that mean?
Okay, I was trying to capture the elements of science that neuroscientists are telling us that stories are not just the narrative that we think that they are. And I know one of the people you've had on this program, whom I've had the pleasure of listening to, Paul J. Zak in California, is a researcher. He talks about things like oxytocin. He talks about things like cortisol, which are neurotoxins that are very, very present or active. They can be activated when we are telling a story. And these stories can activate or trigger these neurotoxins, which also become hormones in our body system. They can raise our body temperature. They can cause our heart to race faster. They can cause us to feel intimidated. They can cause us to sit and lean forward. So that's what I was trying to capture in those bubbles, because we are able to use a simple story to capture both the mind and the heart.
And so this is the elements of story.
Those are the elements of story. And those are critical elements which have now, the scientists have now been able to prove that they can measure them by taking blood samples. They can measure them and they can tell which one is which.
Interesting.
Who is able to, who responds better to a story than the other person. So they can take blood samples and they can actually find that out in the laboratory or through the use of fMRI machines, magnetic resonance machines, as you may be aware of.
Well, now I'm going to have to go and look up what the elements are. C8H11NO2.
Yes.
I'm fascinated. So why did you write the book?
I got to the point whereby I could not just hold back the little that I had learned from many gurus, if I were to put it that way. I had learned from gurus in Asia or people that have been in the craft for a much longer time. I had also learned from those out here in the West when I lived out in Nevada. And I recall driving from Reno, Nevada to Las Vegas. It's a distance of about 16 hours both ways to go listen to a lady known as Patricia Fripp. Maybe you know her. And I discovered that along the way, I'd picked up quite a bit. And it was selfish to only keep that to myself. It was very evident from the questions that people were asking that some people were just struggling to get through the basics. Like, what kind of story can I choose? How do I structure my story? So when those basic questions kept coming in, I discovered that there was an opportunity there for me to put out something with my own name, with my own interpretation, so that those who are coming to my workshops can relate to it in a significant way. I felt it wasn't enough to just quote the big names, quote your good self Park, quote people like Patricia Fripp, quote Robert McKee. I also felt that after 10 years of studying this art, I needed to put something out there with my own interpretations, with some of my own stories. So that's why I wrote the book, to put my stake in the ground and say, I stand behind this, and I feel that I have taken some time to think through it, and it could help someone who is starting out. So it was done for people who are starting out, like a technopreneur, an entrepreneur, someone who has not been familiar with storytelling and they're just getting started. So I wanted to break it down and make it easier for them and provide answers to questions that they were always asking me in my workshops and seminars across Asia and United States.
So you were looking for story gurus. I would think as a story warrior, you would actually be looking for story elders, because that's where you found story as a young man. So people that are very versed in it. Gideon, what are the biggest mistakes, initial mistakes that you see leaders and presenters make when trying to tell a story?
Okay, I would say that most of them, they want to make it very elaborate. They want to turn the story into, it's not going to be a screenplay. It's not going to be, it doesn't have to be 2 pages long. It doesn't have to be 3 pages long. A story can be as short as 3 words, or at least the 3 words sow the seeds of a story in the mind of someone. A story could be 300 words, which means it can be presented in about a minute or 2. So depending on the purpose, I think that the mistake most people make is that they think that a story has to be very, very elaborate. No, I think it doesn't have to be elaborate. And number 2, I also think that some people believe that a story must only be about someone else and not themselves, and that they are not good enough, or they don't want to suffer from the vulnerability of talking about some of their failures. So I at least encourage them that the story can be short. It can be as short as 3 words. because that sows a seed in the mind of the listener. For example, Louis Pasteur, if I could give you this example. When Louis Pasteur, the famous French bioscientist, biochemist, towards the end of his life, someone asked him, Monsieur Pasteur, how would you want to be remembered? What would you want to be written on your headstone? And instead of telling a very long story about all the scientific accomplishments he had, he said 3 words. He said, Joseph Meister lived. And it turns out that Joseph Meister was a young boy that he had used the rabies vaccine on, and that little boy survived. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the story doesn't have to be very long. It can be very short, as 3 words. And those 3 words would allow the other person generate a curiosity in their mind to go find out who was Joseph Meister. And through that curiosity, they get to learn about the rest of the story. And then the second part, as I mentioned, has to do with it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be about somebody else. It can also be about yourself. In other words, you are the authority, and hopefully other people get to see you as you have struggled through life, and what is the lesson that you learn from there.
What was the third word in that? Joseph Meister what?
Joseph Meister lived. That means he lived. He did not die. He lived.
Oh, lived. I got you.
Yeah, he lived.
I got you.
He lived.
Okay. I thought about what you said, the 3-word sentence. I thought, too, about Hemingway's famous 6-word short story. They say the shortest story ever written. You know what that is?
Oh, yes. In fact, and I've used that in some of my workshops, and it's one of the fascinating things that people get really excited about, because with those 6 words, like Hemingway demonstrated, shoes, baby shoes for sale, never worn. If you start to tweak it around, you see that there's a lot that can be said in 6 words. And I've used that in some workshops to illustrate the power of a few words and how those few words can tell a really interesting or magnificent story.
Mm-hmm. I used it, in fact, just last week in a workshop here. And it was just a side thing that came in talking about how short a story could be. And I said that again, for sale baby shoes never worn. And one of the ladies actually jumped up. She goes, oh, I know that one. She said, for sale baby shoes never used. And I said, actually, never worn. And then she thought for a minute. She goes, you're right. That one word makes all the difference, because never used doesn't humanize it, but worn means it was actually on the feet or not. So kind of cool. But to your point, you don't have to have big, long, drawn-out stories to be able to have that enormous impact.
Absolutely. And I think that like in screenwriting, they try to minimize as much as possible. I think that in storytelling too, we should try to minimize as much as possible, because if you want to create a magic moment, you want to create a moment that is memorable, you can do that with only 6 words. I have tried that in the Middle East. I've tried that in Asia, and I see that over and over. People, when they get a hang on it, they will not want to let it go, because you can say a lot with 6 words if you take the time to do it right.
Do you have one of those out the top of your head? I know you've got a ton of stories going on, so it might be hard to pull up, but can you tell us about a time when you used kind of that 6-word approach and you had that magic moment?
Okay, I think I may be able to pull up one, competing between one from Iraq, which was in Kurdistan, where I did a program there for one of the big organizations, was it WHO? And then there's another one from Namibia, which is just next to South Africa. I think that one might be more appropriate. So I went to Namibia in 2013 or so, or 14. And I took a photo with a native Namibian lady who is of the Herero tribe. The Herero women take a lot of pride in wearing these headgears that are very elaborate and very colorful. So when I took that picture, I put it on Facebook. And when I got back to Asia, I will put it in my introductory video, which talks about places where I've conducted workshops all around the world. And people will often ask me, is that your wife? Is that your wife? What are you telling her? What is she telling you? And it looks like this lady, she looks like someone who probably could be, let's say, 4 months expectant. And so in one of the best pieces that we came up with in a workshop, we said, the lady was asking me, honey, I'm pregnant. And then I asked, how many months? She said, 2 months. Or 3 months. And then there have been other versions of it is, ma'am, You're pregnant? Yes. 3 months. So within, I think I can't quite capture it here, but within 6 words, we were able to invoke both laughter and the tension of knowing whether this lady, is she expecting? Is she my wife? Is she not my wife? With just 6 words. And each time we try it in a workshop, I would see people having a very hilarious moment with those 6 words. And so, yeah, that's one that comes to the top of my mind. And hopefully I can find some other way of sharing it with you, because I still use it once in a while.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Could you send us that picture and we'll put it in the show notes so our listeners can take a look at that? And you know what? We might even ask the listeners in the comments section to write their own story about that.
Oh, yes, that would be very interesting.
Would you do that? That would be great, Gideon.
Absolutely.
You know, there's a board game that my wife got me a long time ago, and just with what you're talking about here, it just popped in my head. That's the other thing about stories, is stories trigger other stories, and they trigger moments. But you might like this game, too. It's called Headlines. Simply Headlines. It's really simple.
Okay.
You've got 2 decks of cards. One deck you deal out, you get 4 cards, and each card has a letter on it. So you have to have a word that starts with that letter when you draw your 4-card hand. The other deck simply calls out a section out of the newspaper. So it could be obituaries, it could be sports, it could be for sale, it could be main news, it could be local news, whatever. And then you have a timer, it takes you a minute or so, that you have to come up with a headline for that section of the newspaper using those 4 letters. So you only get 4 words using those 4 letters. And it just occurred to me when you were talking about that, what a marvelous storytelling game that is, because, of course, the winner is whoever comes up with the best headline.
Absolutely.
And the best headline tells a story in relation to that particular category that is drawn. Boy, I just was thinking that is a terrific narrative development game. I guess I'm going to have to get some more of those and hand them out.
Oh, that now you just I am so curious now to find out more about that, because that could be a powerful tool either to get a workshop room or to get executive thinking, and that helps them to discover that writing a compelling story takes a little bit of. You need to be creative. You need to think from different angles, from different points of view, because that's what makes a story interesting. 2 people can tell the same story, and one will get it right, one will get it wrong. The one that gets it right will be the one that looks at it from a very interesting angle. So that game, I think I would want to learn more about your Headlines game.
Well, I'm just, as you're talking, I'm literally typing madly on Amazon, and sure enough, you can buy it on Amazon. Looking at it right now for $5.76. It's got a 4.5-star rating. Wow. Highly recommend it. It's a great, fun game and would really build narrative, intuitive narrative creation.
Yes.
Fun stuff.
And you call that Headlines? If I'm
it's called the Headline, Headlines game. The
Headlines game. And I have another tool that I may share with you. It's a pack of cards, which I don't know, maybe some of your listeners may also find it useful. I ordered this in Asia. The way it works is that they draw out from this pack of cards. Whatever card you draw, if you draw one that has to do with an animal, you find a story, tell a story about one of your pets, about an animal that is precious to you. If you draw a card and it says a relative, you have to create a story on that topic, and that forces you to start thinking, especially for beginners. That gets them thinking and talking about that subject, if that could be helpful too.
What is that card game called?
I have to get the name and send it to you, but I ordered it from a very creative person who is also involved in designing board games, but I would have to find a name for you. I have a picture of it which I can send to you.
Great. We'll also include that in the show notes. Now, Gideon, you've got a method, an interesting method called the Story DNA method that you use, combining elements of neuroscience and dramatic arts to help people create and present memorable business narratives and presentations. Tell us a little bit about your process. My process, the DNA method, I developed it based on work as a trainer. There's something called a training needs analysis. And the training needs analysis is often, it allows me to know what are the needs of my audience, what are the needs of the people that I'll be working with. So based on that, I always ask myself, what are the issues that my audience is going through?
And through that, I discovered that if I could know the distressing things, the distressing issues that an audience is facing, that would allow me to find stories that relate to their distresses or the things that are bothering them at night. So, if my story could provide an answer to the things that keep them up at night, their stressors or distresses, then I believe that in some way I am going to be serving them value, or I'll be sharing a story that is worthwhile. The next thing is the N. The N stands for needs. What are some of their needs? What are some of the things that they want to accomplish, which they have probably not yet accomplished? And how could my stories in some small way help them to accomplish that? And could you give me a second, please?
Sure.
I'm so
Someone's
sorry.
at your door.
Yes, so sorry. Someone just got in there. Just a minute.
Well, while Gideon is away answering his door, this has been so much fun for me because I've been working on a blog post that will be up by the time this show is live called The 5 Stages of Grief in Business Storytelling. And we go right down the list of denial and anger and bargaining and depression and finally acceptance. So if you get a chance, jump over to Business of Story, because a number of the things that we are talking about in today's show, interestingly enough, parallel with the 5 stages of grief in your business storytelling. Sorry, Gideon, while you were away answering the phone, I thought I'd fill a little time. So we're going through your story DNA method. D stands for what is distressing your audience, knowing your audience in a godlike way and what is really bothering them. And that comes right out of Robert McKee and screenwriters. He said the best screenwriters really know both their protagonists in their movies, but they also know the audience they're writing to, so they can connect those two. Number 2 was N, needs, what your audience needs in relation to this distress, I guess.
That's right. So the needs could have to do with things that they, and sometimes I go really technical. I look at Maslow's needs hierarchy, and I look at that and say, okay, where are they on this needs hierarchy?
I'll finish that second.
And once I discover where they are on the needs hierarchy, or I try to interpret that, or I try to infer that, then I find stories or ideas or concepts that I bury within the stories that would give them some inkling of new ideas, of a new way of looking at the solution to that problem that they're facing. And then the third one has to do with aspirations. That's the DNA. The A stands for aspirations. Where do they want to be in future? Do they want the kids to grow up and go to college? Maybe a story about someone else who has been in their shoes could be relevant. Do they want to be able to win a public award? Can I find a story of someone who failed in that process or someone who succeeded in that process and help to show them the mistakes that person made or the techniques that person made? And if I'm able to embed all of that into my story, I can be very sure that if I were to cut down to their DNA, my DNA method would be able to respond to those fears, those aspirations, and those needs that they hold deep to themselves every single day.
And it sounds like this is a 3-part structure or framework that you coach your clients on, that when you've got a presentation ahead of you, just ask yourself those 3 questions. What is distressing my audience? What do they need? And what do they ultimately aspire to have in the future?
Very true. That's what I coach them on very often. And I think I'm getting very interesting feedback from most of them. They say, oh, I used to choose my stories randomly. Now I no longer choose my stories randomly. I put in some effort in identifying stories that would be more appropriate or would have a higher chance of resonance with my audience. And I think I'm seeing some very positive feedback in that area.
Well, Gideon, I know in your book, too, that in the second part of it, you talk a lot about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and how we're all on that. We don't have time today to cover that, but do you realize in just the telling of your story, both in your book and what you shared with us today, that you have been on a pretty amazing hero's journey? You've had this call, to come out. You refused the call of going into storytelling until the universe finally grabbed you by the lapels and shook you around long enough that says, no, Gideon, we actually need you out there training people how to become storytellers. And then, as Joseph Campbell would say, when you follow your bliss, what you really love to do doors will open where there were only walls before. And so now you have been traveling all around the world. And this is, remember, a young boy from the bush country, I guess, a very small village outside of Cameroon in Central Africa. And now you are called upon around the world to teach others. You are essentially their story. Well, you're making story warriors, but you are their story elder. And isn't that pretty cool how you and your story journey reflects the hero's journey?
Oh, thank you for the observation. I think sometimes when I think back at it and I'm like, oh, I never thought I am part of this journey, but indeed I am a part of it in many ways. Like the refusal, when I had the opportunity, I refused initially, which is very much part of the hero's journey. And then along the way, I've gotten mentors, I've gotten people that helped me. And what is very interesting too is that when I decided to map out this journey, I noticed that if you look at the book, you see that there's up and down, there's negative and positive. Almost every single part of Campbell's journey, you'll find that if the first part, if you get a call, maybe get some excitement, you initially go for it. Then after that, when you stumble and fall, you go down to negative energy. So I discovered that the energy tends to either rise or fall all along the story journey. That which is something that I felt is a unique perspective that I saw in Campbell's masterpiece, which I had not seen in most other authors. But I do agree with you. I'm very much a little story. How do I put it? I wouldn't want to say I'm guru yet, but I'm hopefully working on that journey that someday I could get as good as the elders I met in my village.
Well, we never actually ever arrive, do we? But we can only aspire to get better with every step.
I really hope so. But stumbling and falling, getting up, brushing off, looking at the scars and keep running, that's very much the essence of the hero's journey, I believe, until you get to some point whereby you feel like you've discovered a little bit more than most other people, and they start to look up to you, and you can share the little bit that you've discovered in the dark world.
Gideon, if there's one last thought, the one thing that really resonates with you regarding story that you can impart as a storytelling elder to our listeners, what would that be?
I would say that our listeners, your listeners, can pay attention to the new discoveries that are coming from neuroscience, and that there are 4 quick elements that if they embed into a story, that story will become really, really memorable. The first one is novelty. If your story has an element of novelty, usually the amygdala at the back of our brainstem and our brain, it pays attention to novelty. The next element is element of intrigue. If you can create some curiosity in your story, that story is going to be very, very attractive to most people. The next one talks about specificity. If you pay attention to quick details, things that someone can see and feel, that goes a long way. And the last one is surprise. If your stories carry elements of surprise, they also go a long way. And believe you me, if you have those 4 elements, your stories would always stand head and shoulder above the rest.
Novelty, intrigue, specificity, and surprise. Amazing. Amazing. Gideon, where can people learn more about you, and where can they get your wonderful book, The Science of Storytelling?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking. The Science of Story Selling can be found at www.scienceofstorysellingforprofit.com. At the same time, they can also go to my website, which is storywarrior.us, which is one word, www.storywarrior.us. And from that website, they can find some free freebies, some free resources. They can check out some videos on my modest journey and some of the things that I'm doing. And they can have a feel of the boy with a weird name and a goofy accent from Africa who also wants to have a little place and tell his own story.
And I appreciate that. I love your name and I love your goofy accent. I think it's fabulous. And I apologize because I realized the first few times I talked about your book, I said science of storytelling. I couldn't get it out of my head. It's actually the science of story selling. It is a great book. Highly recommend it. Have it by your bedside because Gideon has just chopped us up in small little bite-sized chunks that are just marvelous. The ingredients of becoming a great storyteller. And one day, not only being a story warrior, but being a story elder to help others do the same thing. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Gideon. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Buck. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing for all of us out here who believe in what you're doing. Thank you so much, sir.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for listening to this edition of the Business of Story. If I can help you, I've got a 64-page workbook just waiting for you at businessofstory.com. Now, don't freak out. 64-page workbook doesn't mean you work all 64 pages. I've got examples in there. I've got a video tutorial that links through on every single chapter, and I present you the 10 steps of the story cycle framework, the system to help you clarify your story, to grow your revenue and amplify your impact. I guarantee when you are done with it, you will be so clear and focused on not only what your story is about, but to how to tell it. And if you're not, you have 100% money back guarantee from me. And it's guys like Gideon that have helped me arrive at this too. Like he mentioned earlier in the show, he has been influenced by any number of people out there to get him to become and be the story warrior he is today. I have had the exact same experience. In fact, I've got a library at businessofstory.com that you can see all the people and read the books, watch the videos, listen to the interviews that have had an impact on me building this. So that's why I loved had Gideon here today, because he, I guess, really reflects, and he and I have lived parallel lives in this journey. And what I have for you then is my workbook that can help you, again, clarify your story to amplify your impact. Please join us next week when we have another amazing story artist like Gideon that will be joining us here at Business of Story. And until then, I want you to remember one really important thing, that the most potent story you ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. And until next week, have a wonderful life.